So my guess is that most, if not all of us here today, have deployed, are deploying, or potentially considering deploying database workload in the cloud. And since this topic is kind of very top of mind for us, well, is moving workload to the cloud the right thing to do? So if you're like me, for significant decisions, I like to make, it's kind of old-fashioned, but I like to make those pros and cons lists to help me at least frame my thoughts on the matter. So with that, I would like you to introduce James Serra. James is a big data and data warehouse enthusiast with what I might call an agnostic approach to solutions, meaning that, use the right tool that makes the most sense for the job, which may include relational, NoSQL, big data technology, so very broad spectrum of background that James has. And James, is it fair to say that today you're going to kind of help us with the pros list?
Yes, it's very fair to say that.
Awesome. Okay, so at this point, I will turn it over to you.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Rob. And welcome, everybody. My name is James Serra. I'm a big data evangelist for Microsoft. And I concentrate on the data platform area and have frequent discussions with customers who have a large on-prem SQL Server databases and are looking to move to the cloud and want to know what their options are or what are the benefits of moving to the cloud. So this presentation will cover a lot of the options, and I'm happy to answer questions at the end or follow-ups. Just send me an email listed here on the screen. So a quick overview of myself. I've been doing this quite a long time. Been at Microsoft about 5 years. And before I came to Microsoft, I built a lot of data warehousing, database type solutions. And the cloud has gotten extremely popular, obviously. And we went from a lot of companies not knowing anything about the cloud to contacting Microsoft to find out how they can get in the cloud as quick as possible. But there are a lot of decisions to be made along the way, a lot of products that are involved with moving to the cloud. And part of my daily job is to help clear up the confusion with customers on which products are available and what the proper use cases. So hopefully, after we're done with you, you'll have a better idea. And when they ask if they should move the database to the cloud, I always say yes. There are very few reasons why you wouldn't, and I'll cover a bit of those in there, but now more than ever, we've made it very easy to move your databases, and so I'll talk about some of those approaches. I'll start with some of the on-prem solutions that they have, and the continuum, meaning that how we can keep the consistency from the tools and other products you're using from on-prem into the cloud, and then we'll jump into the IaaS and the PaaS versions and a data warehouse option that we have. At a high level, the benefits of the cloud are listed here: the agility, innovation, and risk. Think of the fact that with the cloud, I have no limits to how I can scale, and I can only pay for when I need. Compare that to on-prem, when it leads into the second part, the quick time to market. And I was a DBA for many years, and I dealt with the pain of trying to install a new server, and you have to figure out what you want. You call the salespeople, they have it delivered. That can take weeks right there or months. Then you have to rack it and stack it, install everything, install SQL Server, back up, restore your database, move all security over and whatnot. And then after a couple of months, you're finally ready to go. With the cloud, I can go to the portal within a couple of clicks. I can have the database up and running in there. It's literally that quick in there. And then there's the ability to scale up or down, as I'll show you later, that you can do instantaneously. You don't have to have all this large upfront payment. You can just pay as you go along. And the cloud, when it comes to risk, you look at availability, reliability, and security, it's so much more than anything you've ever had on-prem. And we will take customers on a data center tour to show them exactly the scale that we have available at these data centers. And it usually blows people away because it is such a larger scale than they're used to in there. And when you get to the security and such, it's just such a grander scale. And we have many discussions with security experts that we bring in from Microsoft to talk to customers to make sure they understand just how secure the cloud is. I always say there are reasons not to move to the cloud. One of them was I actually had a customer who said they can't move to the cloud, and I asked why, and they said, because we want to get servers in a submarine. And I thought, well, yeah, that's a good reason why you couldn't use the cloud. You have no interconnection there, or a slow one. I've lived in Houston. We had customers that were on offshore oil rigs who had little to no internet connections and such. So that's going to be obviously the biggest detriment to moving in the cloud is you have to look at that. But fortunately, I would say 99% of the companies now have fast enough internet connections where that's not a worry. There could be reasons for performance when you get into millisecond, where you have servers in a plant, and I've been at customers who are coordinating package movement through these conveyor belts with needed millisecond response time, or if you can't move your applications to the cloud, or if you're at a point where you just renewed a lease in your data center, and when it's a huge migration effort, there could be reasons to delay the move. And finally, if it's extremely sensitive data. This has gone more and more away as people realize how secure our Azure cloud is. We actually have government clouds and DoD clouds for extra security. But the bottom line is this just means that there may be some databases that you can't move on from on-prem, but there could be a large majority that don't fall in one of these categories that can be moved. So we'll see typically customers have a few that do stay on-prem, but they'll move everything else. And as I touched on, compare this to building your own database. This can take a lot of time and a lot of effort, and some of that is listed here, and this deck will be shared afterwards. But it covers a lot of what the pain you go through when you're moving, when you're controlling everything on-prem if you got your own data center here. And as we'll show, Microsoft take away a lot of this pain that you go through. If we look at SQL Server on-prem over the years, it's changed. In fact, I forgot to update this slide. We're now in 2017. The pace of change is amazing, coming out with updates every year or two. And actually, you'll see that some of the features that are in our data on-prem version first come out in the version in the cloud, and then are brought to the box version on-prem. Now, there it is. There's where I talk about SQL Server 2017, now on Linux. So there are plenty of options on-prem still, and will always continue to be, and we'll make a large investment in that, even though the cloud is becoming very popular. There are some products that people don't know about. If you need to stay on-prem, there's a thing called Superdome X, which is a high-performance server that can allow you to incorporate many different types of databases on top of that. So you want to check that out if you need to stay on-prem and want a bigger solution than what you may have now. This has up to 384 cores and 48 terabytes of memory, so it's a really big box that some companies will use to consolidate what they have into one platform. If you look at, I'm going to build something on-prem, you can go and do it on your own, and that's the homegrown part. There are reference architectures now called Data Warehouse Fast Track that think of it as sort of a blueprint to building a solution. You can use those blueprints, or you can contact a number of vendors like HP and Dell, and they already have fast track appliances that are pre-built, pre-tuned for your workload, particularly data warehouse workloads. And then there's MVP technologies we'll talk about. Microsoft has one called Analytics Platform System. That gets to Netezza and Teradata are competitors that are for very large volume data warehouses where you have a lot of data and you need a lot of quick query performance. So the Data Warehouse Fast Track, as I mentioned, has all these configurations already done to it, and you just order it, it ships, you put it together, most of it's already put together, it's just kind of snapping parts together, and then it's already pre-tuned, so you can avoid the pain that you go through of making sure when you get a new server, it's all optimized and configured, especially the disk systems in that. All this is done for you. When we get to the data warehouses, there's a big difference between what most people use now, especially with SQL Server and SMP solution, jumping to the MPP solution in there. And SMP, think of it as I can scale up, I can continually get new hardware and back up and restore everything, which is a big pain. If you get into the data warehouse, and I'm not talking about OLTP, but strictly data warehousing approaches, The MPP technology gives you the ability to scale out. So I can add servers and it'll redistribute the data, so I don't have to go and move everything from one server to another in there. It's continually building and scaling out the server that you start with in there. And this leads to benefits such as with MPP, you get a piece of all the equipment. Think of it as CPU, memory, and disk are all assigned to your workloads in there. So other people can run workloads that won't overtake the whole server like they do at SMP. And I learned being a DBA to use the kill command because somebody would run a query that was not optimized right and was just causing everybody else to back up because it was consuming other resources. Well, in MPP, you don't have that problem. So if you get into a situation where you have queries and they're taking too long, and that's all variable. Too long could be an hour, or it could be 10 minutes, and you need a lot faster response time in that. That's when you want to look at MPP technologies for your data warehouse solutions. We have those on-prem and in the cloud. The on-prem version is called Microsoft Analytics Platform System. Used to call Parallel Data Warehouse. This whole presentation is just on that, but that's a solution you may want to look at if you want to stay on-prem and you need a large data warehouse. If we look at the high level, our products, and I'm going to talk about the upper left here, where we're looking at cloud and relational products in here. There's a whole other set of products when you get into non-relational or NoSQL, or if you need to stay on-prem, and those are other separate presentations, but I'm going to concentrate on, I need to move some databases on-prem into the cloud, whether they be OLTP or data warehouse, what are my options? And it's important to understand where everything fits in. So if we look at this presentation at the slide, at the bottom left, we have the SQL Server. If you're on the physical machines, raw iron, we rarely see that now. Usually it's the next step. They virtualize it, but they're all on-prem. Now you can take those virtualized machines and you can move them to the cloud as is, or you can build a new one. So it's really very similar to what you would do on-prem, as you connect remotely into this VM. You would do that, except the VM would be in Azure. And that's called IaaS, Infrastructure as a Service. A step up from that is called Platform as a Service. And we'll talk about those products in there. And when you look at the differences, when we go from on-prem to infrastructure, Microsoft is now managing the virtualization, the servers, the storage, and the networking. So you no longer would get those calls at 3 a.m. that something's wrong with the hardware and the databases aren't responsive. Microsoft handles all that, including the storage part of that. And that's a big deal. And that takes a lot off the plate of the DBAs and the storage architects, the SAN people. They can work on them building solutions and not have to worry about maintaining the hardware. A step up from that is Platform as a Service, where there are no virtual machines. Microsoft takes care of the runtime and the middleware and operating system, so you won't have to go in there and patch things. You won't remote into the VMs. Yeah, somewhere behind the scenes there are VMs running all this, but you're unaware of them. You don't need to know about them. So all you care about is applications of data. That is building the databases and the tables and writing the ETL. Those kind of things are what you take care of. Everything else is concentrated in Azure and run by Microsoft. And a step up from that, which we don't talk about, but to put in context is software as a service, things like Office 365, where applications of data are then in control of Microsoft. And as I mentioned, it's really important to have the same consistency in tools across all the products in there. So if you're using SSMS, for example, that can be used on-prem, but as well as in the cloud for all our products in there. So you can use the same tools you're familiar with, whether your database is on-prem or in the cloud. Now jumping into IaaS, this is where you would create a VM, and we have many different types of VMs you can choose from. You can even go back to SQL Server 2008 R2, and everything after that, you can get VMs and have those products already installed on the boxes when you fire them up. So now we're also saving you time on having to install SQL Server in there. And so we have different versions of Windows you can get. The boxes you can RDP, or you can control everything through PowerShell. PowerShell is a scripting language, and anything you can do through the portal, you can also do through PowerShell. For example, many companies will have PowerShell scripts that are going to go fire up sometimes dozens of VMs. for training purposes and then configure them all through the scripting. And then when they're done, they run this PowerShell script to shut them all down. So everything can be controlled that way. And you pay per use per minute, so it's only when running. So if you were done, as in the training example, you can just shut it all down. You don't have to pay for anything. Compare that to on-prem, it's a world of difference. And the money you can save on that is tremendous. And the elasticity gets into the different size of boxes in there. We have anywhere from 1 core to 128 cores, so there's a large variety to choose from. And you can scale up and down on those VMs after you allocate them, which I'll show. There's so many different VMs options in here, and I only list a few of them, the most common ones that I see for SQL Server. We have a lot of different tiers and groups, the G series, the M series. You can see how big some of these can get. And we also have storage options where we go to standard or premium storage. Difference being standard is regular disk and premium storage is SSD. So you'll typically see customers use standard storage to save some money for testing or training environments, and then premium storage when they're looking at production workloads. If you want some idea of what the cost is for these, you can go to Azure Calculator and I'll give you a ballpark idea. It's kind of like sticker prices if you look at that. Another cool thing that we have to simplify creating VMs is this gallery of images. And I think I checked yesterday and it had another, we're over 5,000 now, where it's basically VMs that are already pre-configured. So instead of creating a VM that's raw, that just has the operating system, you can get one that's also got SQL Server installed. It could have many other products installed in there. So third-party products can create VMs, and you can just use those as a starting point as opposed to starting from scratch in there. So generally, clients will use one of these, especially when it comes to SQL Server. And I don't like to talk much about licensing. I'll leave that for others, but you can bring your own license. So some of these VMs, you just transfer your on-prem license to the cloud, and you pay a certain price for per minute charges, or you can say, I don't have a license and I pay a higher per minute charge because the license is sort of built into that. So you definitely want to look at the gallery when you're looking to move to the cloud to shortcut your process of building a solution or moving a solution. We also have templates. So think of this as I talk about the PowerShell scripts that can fire up a handful of servers and configure them. You can create a PowerShell script that sets up a whole always-on availability groups, and it can do a lot of other things with these PowerShell scripts. So customers have created these PowerShell scripts, and it could be very complicated, and they've uploaded them to this site to share them with others, so you can use those as a starting point so you don't have to start from scratch too. So we have, I think, over 700 of these now. So it's another great way when you say, oh, I could really use a template, let me go see what's already available and use that as a starting point. It's important to understand the virtual storage architecture. When we talk about the cloud, we have, and you provision a VM, you're going to see where it has pre-allocated storage, which is on your C drive, and that's where the OS is, and you'll usually have some data that's free, and that's all, and as well as a disk cache, and then you have a temporary disk on there where you'll see things like TempDB. And then you'll also have the ability to expand on the storage that comes with it by having external disks that you can attach, and you can have storage up to 1 terabyte. Actually, we're now up to 4 terabytes on that. So if the original VM doesn't have enough storage, you can expand on it. And it's important to understand that all this storage is stored on what we call Azure Blob Storage. And the big benefit of this is it has duplicate copies of the data. So you'll have at least 3 copies of everything you store out there. I like to say it's sort of like having RAID built into the storage in there. So you don't have to worry about high availability and taking care of that because blob storage has that built in. And every time you write something through your database, it gets 3 copies of that. And so that's real important to understand, because right away that simplifies your life when you move to the cloud by having that high availability built in. And as I mentioned, it's like having RAID in there, and there's where I corrected it. You can have 4 terabyte disks, and you can have up to 64 of them. So you can actually go up to 256 byte total when you create a VM. And this is how you do it. You can go into the storage configuration when you're setting up your VM. You go into SQL Server settings. We made it so you can move these bars up and down, and it will recommend how many disks you should attach to, because in addition to getting more space by having more disks, you can also get higher throughput on that. And that's what this page does to you. And then we'll create window storage spaces so you won't have to see individual drives like E, F, G, and H. It can be made to look like one drive, so it takes the complexity out of there for you, and you have this one large drive that can be up to that 256 terabytes. We have now, we just updated, we actually have 54 regions, and so these are data centers. Each region has multiple data centers all across the world, and generally clients will pick a data center that's a region that's near them for latency issues. But since we've expanded this, almost all parts of the world has something close. And generally what they'll do is you want to look at a region that has all the various Microsoft products that you want to use, and you pick that region, and then everything you provision is inside that region. So you'll have databases and applications and such all in the same region there. And there's a lot of security on this, and if you are in a country that can't have data outside the regions, then we have that option and such. And then we'll get into, you can pair regions for disaster recovery and such. But it's important to see just how much of the world we cover with these various regions. There's many ways to migrating data, and that's a whole presentation in itself. And I just listed them here that you can read later by looking at the deck, but there's a lot of options, including a new one called Azure Database Migration Services, and we're trying to make it really easy for you to migrate, to the point where with the migration service, you just go to an Azure portal and you say, here's my SQL Server that's on-prem, and here's where I want to move it to in the cloud, and you click a button and it takes care of everything. It moves the code and the data over for you. So there's a lot of different options, and because you'll get into things like, well, I have many terabytes of data and it takes too long to move it through the internet channels, and then we have options where you can use an import-export service where you can have the data copied to a USB and then you ship it to a data center, and then we'll restore it on one of the drives and such. So there's a lot of different ways of handling the movement of data as well as the transferring of the code and such. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in upcoming slides. The great thing is how easy to scale. So when this slide shows you, I just go to the Azure portal, I go to settings, I click size, and I'm going to be given a whole choice of sizes that I can move to, whether I move up or down. And once I do that, on the screen here, you'll see it says resizing virtual machine, and that takes just a couple minutes. It does a reboot, and you're off and running in there. And it's quite a drastic change from comparing that to on-prem, where it could take weeks to months to move to new hardware. Here is just a few clicks, a few minutes, and you have a new box. And this could be where I can decide to be conservative when I'm having a new database, and I can start out with a smaller VM. And if I find that I'm running into performance issues, I can instantly upgrade it. Or if I find out it's too much, I can downgrade it. Or I can do things throughout the day or the week where I can use PowerShell scripts to say, after 5 p.m. of the workday, I want to scale these down, or I want to shut them off, or on the weekends and such. So there's a great way to save money by scaling up or down. And you don't have to worry about the complexity. If you think of on-prem, is I have to buy hardware that's going to handle peak performance. And I don't have to worry about that in the cloud because I can move up or down. In a prior life, I ran a fantasy football website that ran leagues, and Sundays were tremendously busy, and I had to get hardware to handle all the real-time scoring. But come during the week, the CPU would go down to 2 and 3%. Well, I was out of luck. I had the hardware, and there's nothing I can do about it. With this, is I can scale up or down. So during those slow days on the week, I can scale it down to a smaller VM to save costs. With the fact that it's in our cloud, there's a lot of benefits that we give to you. One of them is automated management on there, so patching and backing up are all done for you and set up automatically. You can even do high availability, always on, if you wanted to through this, or you can even do clustering now. Generally, you don't need those because of the fact that the blob storage stores 3 copies and such, but all these solutions become available, and are all done through an Azure portal to make your life a lot easier in there. We have monitoring tools on here, so these are pretty sophisticated. So you may not need to use a third-party monitoring tool, but if you can, most of them will still work with SQL Server in an IaaS solution. And as I mentioned, anything that you're doing on-prem, as far as architectures can be done, everything from the always-on availability groups to log shipping and such. And there's best practices on this link on the bottom here. You can go and you can see the recommendations we have when you're using VM. Some of these are typical that you would see on-prem, but there's a little bit of difference in the cloud, so we want to make sure we listed those so you're aware of how you can get the most performance out of your VMs. So that was covering IaaS. Now we're going to jump to the PaaS version in there. So this makes your life even easier, and we recommend clients look at PaaS versions first. It's a database as a service, so you will not have to go and provision a VM. You will just go to the Azure portal. You say, I need a database, and it's there and created for you in a matter of a couple of minutes. And you get the same ability to scale up or down with these databases, and you have the same tools that you can use. And there's a lot of options that I'll talk through for continuity and disaster recovery that come with this. And new features will be on this SQL database before SQL Server. And it's quite challenging to keep up with it because every couple of weeks there's a new feature that is put out there. And we roll it out over the region so you can use it right away, so you don't have to wait till the box version. And this will make the box versions be so much more stable than they have been in prior years, because when they get a new feature, it's already been used in the cloud. So it's been fully tested and debugged and used by millions of people in there. So it becomes rock solid. And then we put it in the on-prem solution. So this is what you would do when you go through Azure portal is you will create a SQL server. I call these a logical server because you're not really creating anything other than a container that's going to hold all your databases. And anything you need to do at the higher level, it's sort of like an instance level, is done through here. Things like a firewall or security, where it can control all the databases underneath it. And if you need to create a database, you'll go to this screen, and you'll just click on the add column, and you'll specify the configuration of the database, and you'll have it within a couple of minutes here. And then you can do things individually to each database, like dynamic data masking, TDE, auditing and threat detection, all these additional features that are either already in SQL Server on-prem, but some of these are additional that you don't get on-prem, like the threat detection and such. So the benefits come, and this is a marketing slide, I apologize, but some of this is very accurate and true. Think about the faster time to market with some of our customers, 75% faster development cycle. So when people talk about pricing, a lot of times that is one of the lower concerns when they move to the cloud, because they want to start building a solution fast and not have to wait weeks or months to be able to do that. And that's where the term fail fast comes, is I can build these new databases, I can try something out. If it doesn't work, I can shut everything down. If it works, I have the ability to scale up unlimited and have all those benefits of the cloud with this security, ability, and availability and such in there. And it's hard to put price on that. Some customers will ask, well, price it all out, but when you go to, well, I can have a database solution within a few minutes, you can't really put a price tag on that, or have better security or reliability and those kind of things. And that's where it comes to the reduced risk and the increased productivity. It's designed for predictable performance. So in other words, instead of having to keep track of CPU and IO and memory, we came up with the concept of called database transactions units, where you can just say, I want a certain amount of performance, and I'm going to choose one of the DTUs, and we have some tools that will go through and allow you to predict what those DTUs should be when you move from on-cloud to the prem. When you move from prem to on-cloud, by running performance against what you have now and coming up with what we suggest. But the great thing is, if it's not enough or it's too much, you can scale up or down. So I'll tell customers, just be conservative. You can start with 100 DTU, and if you find if that's not enough and you want to double it, you just go to 200 DTU. And so we simplify things. Now, interesting enough, customers came back and they still wanted the ability to know how many cores and memory we're using. And so another thing we came up with, which I don't mention in the slide deck, but it's called vCores. And it allows you to specify exactly how many cores and how much memory you want to use. So if you want to go that route, we have that option now. And it also helps a little bit in simplifying licensing, moving from on-prem to the cloud. And that's why we came out with the vCore option. But the idea is the same, as you can scale up and it's pretty linear. So if I double my vCores, I'll get double the performance. And the way to set scale DTUs, and the same thing with vCores, is once I create this database, I can just go here, I click on the setting, the pricing tier in here, and I just choose another level. And this is actually updated, so we now separate out the compute and storage. So I can say I want a higher number of DTUs, and or I want a higher or lower number of storage for my databases in here. So that is available through DTUs as well as vCores. And again, people will use PowerShell to scale this up or down depending on time of day or the day of the week. This is my favorite slide because this shows disaster recovery and how much we simplified this. And if you're a DBA and you think of how difficult it is to say, set up availability, always-on availability groups and to maintain them, keep that in mind when you look at this screen. Is you will go to the screen, it's just one click away, and it'll show you, hey, you have our database is now in this shows in the US East, and we recommend choosing the US West for your disaster recovery site. And you just click on that, you configure it, and you hit OK, and within a couple minutes you'll see it syncing, and you will have a duplicate secondary over in the US West, and you don't have to manage it, and that's all that's that's all you need to do to set it up is a couple of clicks of a mouse. And again, compare it to availability groups, which can take a lot of time-consuming process. And I'm actually coming out with a blog in a couple of days that goes into some more detail of what disaster recovery works and high availability looks like. But behind the scenes is basically using availability groups. But you're abstracted from the complexities of all that. And you can actually have up to 4 secondaries, and you can make those readable. So customers will do this for scaling out read workloads. And so you can put, say, a load balancer in front of that, or you can connect directly to these secondaries and offload those read queries from the main primary database. So this is a tremendous amount of, there's a big amount of time saver that we see, and this is one of the big features of the PaaS version. And if we look at, as I mentioned before, you can have 3 copies. So this slide shows on the left, each time I write to the database, I get 3 copies of it. And if on the right-hand side, if I have a secondary set up, a disaster recovery, and lightning happens and the primary goes out, it'll redirect to the secondaries in there, which also has 3 copies. So you'll have, in essence, 6 copies of your data when you have a secondary set up, at least one secondary set up. So this allows for the 4 nines, and that's a guarantee that we have with SQL Database. Whether you're using disaster recovery or not, the high availability will give you those 4 nines. We actually also have the way to do automatic failover. So you can specify manual or automatic, and some companies, they prefer not to do it automatic because they maybe want to wait it out if there's a problem. But we have both options now, so it's a great way to have end users not see any downtime by switching over to a disaster recovery site if something goes wrong. We have the ability to do backups. These backups will start as soon as you create a database. It automatically creates a backup for you. You don't have to go and specify I want to do backups. Now you have the ability to go add additional backups and store them even up to 10 years. You can have daily and weekly and monthly and yearly backups, and you can do all that. But right away, the backups are done for you, and it's just-in-time recovery. So if there's a problem, I can go in there and say, well, somebody deleted the database at 10 p.m. I'm going to go back to 9:59 and I'm going to restore that database in there. And the screen is just basically choose the time and click restore, and you'll get another copy of the database in there. Now you also have the option to back up database to another region. So if you're in a situation where I can avoid a few hours, I'm fine with a few hours of downtime and I want to save some money, instead of using a disaster recovery, a secondary, I can just have a backup in another region. And if something happens, I can go to that other region and I can fire up and I can restore the database in that other region there. So it's a different type of disaster recovery that you can do. no different than having offsite backups. It's the same concept. And so this is where, as I mentioned, you can restore to another, you can back up to another region, restore to that region or another region. So you have all these regions across the country, and you just want to plan it up front, is how do I want to lay all this out? And once you do, it's easy to set up, and then you can have a disaster recovery plan that is very efficient and very easy to maintain. So the Geo Replication, as I touched on before with disaster recovery, when it's called Geo Replication, is you can have those 4 secondaries I mentioned, and so the recovery time for some of these could be under 5 minutes. If something goes wrong, it'll fail over. You can set it up to that it actually fails over in milliseconds and such, and so this is all part of our SLAs. If we look at the different tiers on here, this is where we have the ability to choose different performance levels based on DTU. And as I mentioned, we also have vCores now, and so this gives you some idea of the levels you can choose from when setting up your databases. We have many migration tools. These are screenshots of some of them. The database migration service will be the one going forward that we're going to recommend for most situations. We can even move from competitor products such as Oracle to the cloud, and some of these tools will look at your code and tell you if there's any issues that may happen with incompatibilities from moving to the cloud, and that's what the data migration assistant is for. And so if we look at both of these options, which ones to use, I try to put in the slide the difference between the two, and it gets into instance level is SQL Server and the VM, where database level is the SQL database. And it depends on how much access you want to the VM, and in the few cases where customers want to stay in VM is maybe they need access to the operating system through their databases, or maybe they have some third-party application that needs to be installed alongside of it, so they need to get into the VM to do these things. Otherwise, the database will be great for their needs. And the SLAs, as I mentioned, is 4 nines with database, and with the VM, it's 3 nines and a 0.05 after that. And there's even things you can do now to increase that through availability sets and such, which is a different conversation. But we have plenty of options for every customer I've dealt with is meeting their SLAs. Now, there are some limitations with SQL Database, and this will change, and I'll talk about it in a minute, but there's some things that are not supported in the standard SQL database, such as cross-database joins and VNet. And so with many customers, SQL Database was a great option for new solutions, but not so great when you're migrating over. If you had some code incompatibilities, and that's what the database migration assistant would tell you. And if it was too much work, they may say, well, we're just going to put SQL Server in a VM for those and use SQL Database for other ones. And on the right is there are, as I mentioned, there are features that come with SQL Database you don't get with the VMs, and that's probably going to increase because we're always coming out with new features that take advantage of the fact that many other customers are on the cloud. In particular, the Database Advisor, where it uses machine learning to help recommend index tuning, the indexes you should create or drop. It'll come back with that, and that's through all the other companies having databases on the cloud that were able to analyze the information of queries that are fast and slow. So what we added is this new solution that's in public preview now called SQL Database Managed Instance. And so think of the version I talk about as the single version. This managed instance is an enhancement. So everything I talked about in the previous slides applies to managed instance and more. It has additional features that come with it. And it is, again, a managed service now. So we have 3 versions of managed instance, Singleton, Elastic Pool, which I didn't touch on, but basically that's a way to pool all your resources together. So I can put many databases under one performance tier and have all those databases hit that performance tier, as opposed to having each database have its own performance tier. So it's a way to save additional money by consolidating a lot of databases. So we'll see companies that have many databases that are not used very much. They'll put a ton of those under Elastic Pool. And that works fine as long as one database doesn't decide to have a lot of hits and queries against it all of a sudden, in which case they'll usually pull it out. But it's another option for you. But the SQL Database Managed Instance now has support for all these features that SQL Database single version doesn't have. And here's a list of all those. And so we'll see companies have migrated thousands of databases to the cloud with no code changes because it supports everything from SQL Agent to DB Mail to TDE to cross-database queries to VNet support. All this is part of Managed Instance. So we're seeing a huge migration of companies moving on-prem to the cloud to SQL Server Database Managed Instance. It even has a compatibility mode in there, just like you do with on-prem, where you can specify a compatibility mode, and we go back all the way to 2005. And the instances right now so this increases, and I didn't mention the single version now has databases up to 4 terabytes. The managed instance right now goes 8 with the ability to eventually go up to 35 and more. But right now in public preview, you can go up to 8 terabyte size. And this is how easy it is. You can go on-prem, you can back up your database to the storage account, blob storage, in Azure, and then you fire up a SQL Server Managed Instance, and then you restore that database to Managed Instance. And then your app that could have been pointing to on-prem, you change the connection string to point it to SQL Database Managed Instance, and you're off and running. We even have demos that show how quickly this can be done. And this process, even though it's pretty simple, you can actually automate it with Database Migration Service. So it will actually take up the backups and move everything over for you, so you don't have to do anything manual. So that's how easy we made it. And you can automate a lot of this with PowerShell too. So that's where we see companies having huge migrations to the cloud because of how easy we've made it with Managed Instance now. And Managed Instance, as I mentioned, is public preview, and soon it'll be in GA, and we'll have a big announcement when that happens. And I have whole decks just on Managed Instance that go into more details on this. But you'll find again, the end user environment as a DBA that you're familiar with, SMS, works just like SQL Server Managed Instance, works the same. So you can go to SMS, and instead of pointing to something on-prem, you'll point to this Managed Instance, and everything you do is done the same way, whether it be creating databases and managing them are all done through SMS, or any other tool you may be familiar with can be done. And the other thing I want to talk about is SQL Data Warehouse. So this is a PaaS version 2, built on SQL Database. And the big difference is that this is optimized for a data warehouse. So you wouldn't use this for OLTP, but think of use cases, and this happens a lot now with customers where they move their database, their data warehouse to the cloud, and now have the ability to incorporate a lot more data than they couldn't incorporate on-prem. So as a DBA, I had to tell end users no many times when they said, we want to add this additional data. And I said, no, because we don't have the storage space or the compute power, or we have this maintenance window. All those problems go away because the data warehouse is unlimited scale. It has the ability to handle data that's relational and non-relational. It has performance you need, so queries can run a lot faster. And it also takes away having to do maintenance windows, because you can design this to do loads and such during the day. So now you open up the door for having all these other sources of data. In particular, think of IoT, Internet of Things, where I have devices that are streaming over data and I want to capture all that. Social media data is a big one now. I want to have Twitter data incorporated into my data warehouse. I want to know what people are saying about my company. And we have those can all now say yes to them because of the scalability of the data warehouse and the performance benefits you get with it. You can also resize this just like I showed you before. It's actually even easier in here. There's a slider bar that you can use that goes up or down into what we call data warehouse units. again, the same linear comes into play. Is if I want to double my speed of the queries, I just double the DWUs I'm using. And the compute and storage are separate. And so that's why we are able to scale up very quickly, is we don't have to reallocate the storage in there. You can say, I want more processing power, and you get that in a couple minutes without having to move the data around. This also gives you the ability to, and here's where I talk about the DWUs. It's literally a slider bar that can go up and down and get you that advanced performance. And we also have the ability to pause the SQL database. So to save money on here is I can go and say, pause it, and we'll see companies do that, say, after hours or on the weekends. And so you're not paying for anything other than storage costs, which is relatively very inexpensive. And also, again, you can use PowerShell to scale up or down. So we'll see companies say, we have very little users. After hours or on the weekends, we'll scale it down. On the opposite side, we get a lot of people come in Monday mornings, and maybe we're doing some loading during nights, and at night we want to scale up during those times. And so we'll have the PowerShell scripts to do that. We have the ability to use Polybase, which is a technology, it's sort of an abstraction level that allows you to put data into Hadoop storage, or data lake store, blob storage that we have, and it could be non-relational data. And so instead of having to take that data and move it and write ETL into the data warehouse, within SQL Data Warehouse, you can create an external table, it's called, which is a pointer to that data sitting in Hadoop. So think of it as maybe I've dumped a bunch of CSV files in there. And if I just do a create table external and I point to that file and I give it some structure on that and say, here are the fields, I can then have users run that query on that table and get results, and they won't even realize it's actually sitting in Hadoop. So you get the benefit of not having to move the data, and you get a federated query approach, with the trade-off is it may not be as fast because it's now got to pull it from Hadoop. Now, this particularly comes into play with SQL Server, with SQL Data Warehouse. In Polybase is used to import data very quickly because it can also parallelize the import. So in MPP, you have many servers, as I mentioned, is you can parallelize and use all those servers to import the data at once in there. So we'll see tremendous performance gain by using Polybase in there. And Polybase will be expanded to have more options of federated query, where it can actually push down the queries, and they can use it against, not only against Hadoop, but it could be the data stored in Oracle or Teradata or other SQL Server boxes. So we're getting to this logical data warehouse federated query approach, because a lot of data doesn't make sense sometimes to move it into the data warehouse. So let's access it this way, and we find value of it. Maybe we'll want to write ETL to have it permanently in the data warehouse. But if it's a one-off report, if we want to see some value first, we can set it up to use external tables. And as I mentioned, you can pause it, so you're only paying for the storage, and it can all be automated. And so the data remains in place, and it's not like the data is inaccessible. It's still there, but and once you resume it within 1 or 2 minutes, you'll have the ability to start accessing that data again. We have automatic backups within SQL Data Warehouse. So just like SQL Database, it's just not as frequent because of the size of the data warehouses. And we've added some new features to this, and now have the ability to do backups that you can store up to 35 days. You can do the just-in-time restores like I mentioned previously. It all works right out of the box in there, so there's nothing you need to configure or set up. It'll do all that for you. And you can also have those backups go to another region. So again, for disaster recovery purposes, you can have that backup in a different region, and if something goes wrong with all of the East Coast, you can say, well, I'll go to the West Coast, and I'll restore that backup to the West Coast, and I'm off and running. And so summary is, it is a data warehouse as a service, is a term that I see frequently used. Queries can be anywhere from 20 to 100 times faster on it. So it's a great solution if you run into, hey, my queries are taking really long time, customers are complaining, I'm running out of options with my scaling up, I want to scale out, the data warehouse can do that. And a lot of times we'll see customers greatly simplify their data warehouse setup when they go from on-prem to the cloud, because they wrote all this ETL that was sort of doing workarounds and band-aids. It could be everything from sharding, to have different file groups, all sorts of ways that they got around performance issues now go away with the SQL Data Warehouse because it's so fast that you don't have to have those workarounds. So the ETL generally gets greatly simplified. And the only difference, well, the biggest difference between Data Warehouse is the way the data is spread out. It's spread out among a number of nodes. And when you submit a query, that query will go out and split out to multiple queries, go to all those nodes, push down the query, run it locally, and return the results, smash them up, and send them back. The trade-off on that is you have to have a distribution case. You have to specify how you want this data distributed. And usually we spend a half a day with DBAs and go over the concept of that, and they understand it and are off and running. Because everything else is pretty much the same, the way you write stored procedures in SQL code, with some caveats that Data Warehouse is a batch-oriented system, so you wouldn't want to do things like cursors that go row by row. But once you understand all that and a few nuanced differences, you can be off and running just in a matter of a couple of days. And this slide talks about some of those differences between an on-prem data warehouse and what you'll see in the SQL Data Warehouse, and there's the link at the bottom. So I want to make it clear, things like, as I mentioned, cursors are not supported, and there's a few other things that are not supported, so you want to be aware of that, so there could be some migration effort when you move it over. And we do have tools that you can run that'll look at your code and tell you areas that may need to be changed. But the great thing is a lot of the code becomes greatly simplified because of the speed and power that you get with the SQL Data Warehouse. So people may say, this is great, I want to get started, I want to start playing with this stuff, James. How do I do that without incurring a bunch of costs? Because maybe I don't have an Azure subscription. Or maybe I do, like under MSDN, but it's limited to $200 a month or such. Well, we have a way to go and test out SQL Database and a bunch of other products for free with some limitations, like with SQL Database is 250 gigabytes in there. So you can go and you can go today and you can start playing with these products and get familiar with them, and you can see the benefits of them without having to rack up some bill on your credit card in there. Even with SQL Data Warehouse, you go to this link, and we can give you the option of using a free version of it, or I should say the version is the same. You'll get some credits to go do your own POC, so you want to check this out. Because it can be expensive, SQL Data Warehouse, and you don't want to have any surprises on your subscription, so definitely check this out if you want to play with it and in the context of creating a POC, proof of concept. So to me, in closing, it's really a no-brainer of moving to the cloud. It's just a question of when. Yeah, there'll be caveats and there'll be certain things that you may not be able to move, but a majority of them you can. And this is essentially what I do day in and day out with customers, is I explain to them all these options. I will sit down and whiteboard them because it could be confusing, and with this pace of change coming, there could be some clarification that I need to do with customers on these different products, and that's what I'm happy to do. So if you want to send me an email and I can answer that way, or we can set up a call and I can chat with you. And hopefully you found some value out of this presentation, have some idea of these tools, and maybe some of you will go and start playing with them. And now I'll leave it open for any questions that we may want to take. So yeah, the slides will be, that's one of the questions will be made available, as well as the recording shortly after this. And I also have this on my website. I didn't post it, but jamesserra.com. I have a lot of presentations and blogs that go into more detail about some of these products if you want to check that out. So Rob, if you want to take over.
Yeah, perfect. I don't see anything else in chat or Q&A, so I think with that, we can go ahead and wrap it up. Just a huge thank you to James for joining us today and walking us through all things Azure and cloud, and definitely gives us good things to think about. But I think the overwhelming vote is yeah, do it. It's a no-brainer, right? And I think you're right. It's a question of when, not if, right?
Yeah, and a quick story is I will go to DBAs who've been DBAs for SQL Server for many, many years and had no idea we had these products, and I'll sit down with them and I'll go through the portal and set up a few things for them, and their mouth just goes wide open and their eyes get really big and they go, my God, I didn't realize how easy this was, and it's great that you told me about this. And unless you like getting those 2 a.m. phone calls that there's hardware issues, then this is going to be for you. And you can spend your time focused on building a solution. And you still need DBAs, you still need people that tune queries and set up the databases and do all those other things that we enjoy doing as DBAs, as opposed to putting out fires and watching that we have some problem with the hardware. You still want to watch that the queries are performing as needed, and you can definitely help with that. But to me, that was always the fun part, and not that, oh, there's some problem and having fights with the stand guys of the performance. That all goes away, and it leaves us to do the really fun stuff.
Yeah, really elevates the DBA's game, right?
Yes, and DBAs, as I mentioned, don't go away. It's some of their job description will change, and they'll be focused more on doing that fun stuff. So that should be part of a new line of DBAs, is we get to do more fun stuff when we move to the cloud. And think of it, if you migrate to the cloud, how valuable you'll be by having that experience, because every company in existence is eventually going to move to the cloud. And so if you're part of and have done that migration, you'll be very, very valuable.
Yeah, no, definitely, and I strongly believe in that as well. Hey, James, we do have a couple of questions that came up on chat. Do you mind kind of pivoting over there for a sec?
Sure.
Yeah, so under chat, the first one is, what happens when a new version of SQL Server comes up?
So I don't have to clarify in the cloud, and I get this question frequently, is when we have new features that come out in the cloud, they won't break anything. You can imagine if they did, how many people would have a lot of pain. So,
the 2 a.m. phone call, right?
We have a lot of ways of rolling this out, and we go into private preview and public preview and rolling out slowly over different regions and such. So we won't come out with new versions, but rather you'll just go to your portal and say, hey, we got this new feature. And if you want to use it, go ahead. And some customers are in private preview and they get notified before of those things. But there's no having to worry that things are going to break because we have new features, which could happen on-prem. And as I said, all those new features will come out, and we'll sort of group those together and then add them to the box version on-prem.
Yeah, no, great explanation. And then another question was, how do you handle the upgrade? And I think that was kind of implied in the last answer as well, is that you don't necessarily have to handle the upgrade. You'll just get new features with basically what amounts to continual deployment, right?
Exactly. It's continual deployment. And then underneath the covers, there are patches made to operating systems and SQL Server and security things that are done without you having to worry about it, without the downtime. And again, I'm about to blog some of that because it's a common question I get. But that's the benefit of the cloud, is in the PaaS versions. The VM, if you get IaaS, you have to do all those patching. We take care of all that, and we will do it. And there are ways to specify maintenance windows and such for VMs to hopefully reduce the pain if you want to do any patching. But with the PaaS version of that generally goes away unless it's rare circumstances. So that whole process of, oh, there's some security thing and we need to go patch our stuff, companies will contact us and we've already paid the patch in there. So that's the huge benefit you get of the PaaS versions.
Awesome. Okay, hey, in the interest of time, I think there's one or two more questions, but I think we need to wrap it up. We're at the top of the hour. So just a plug for James, go check out his blog, follow him. Great content out there. And James, again, a huge shout out to you. Thank you very much for joining us today, and thank everybody who was on the call today.